Well, folks, welcome to the Noble Man Podcast. I am excited to have as my guest today a friend that I've known for a number of years, Roland Warren, who is the director of CareNet Pregnancy Centers. But we met years ago when you were president of the National Fatherhood Initiative. So welcome to the podcast, Roland.
Yes, good to be with you, Mike. Yeah, that was many years ago. I had no gray hair at that time. And I remember you well. You're hard to miss. And it's just funny how God kind of directs our paths and intersects stuff and things of that nature. And so I've been with CareNet for 12 years now. It'll be 13
right.
This next October to be 13 years after being with National Fatherhood Initiative for about 12 years there. And God called me into this setting and kind of brought a lot of what I had learned doing the fatherhood work into this work as well.
Well, you know, I look back over my life and I coached football and soccer. I was a high school teacher in the classroom. Then I was a high school administrator. And then I worked in a family construction business all before launching into ministry. And so I look back and I see how God was using each piece of my story to prepare me uniquely for the work that I'm doing now to help churches disciple men. And so sometimes we look into the rearview mirror and see more clearly what's in front of us in terms of the windshield. So you've got a story here about the Fatherhood Initiative and your business background and everything. So tell us a little bit about how God uniquely prepared you for the work that he has you doing with CareNet right now.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I sort of, when I tell people the story, it's almost like well, I grew up in a log cabin, that kind of thing. But really, my fatherhood work or my awareness around the issue really started when I was a boy because I grew up without a father in the home. My dad and my mother, split up when I was, 7, 8 years old. And for most of my life, I grew up, in a single mother home. My dad was in town, and he came for, I call it the kind of holy days of fathering obligation, birthdays and Christmas and stuff like that. But for the most part, in terms of being involved in my life on a day-to-day basis, he really wasn't there. So, I had an acute awareness about that absence and didn't know how to kind of deal with it. And frankly, in a lot of ways, just kind of stuffed it like a lot of guys do until much later. I ended up graduating from high school, went to Princeton undergrad, and during my junior year, I got my girlfriend, who was a sophomore, pregnant. And so I was 20, she was 19. And here I was facing this fatherhood situation, having grown up without a dad. And so we ended up, which you find out in the book that I wrote, to learn more about that story. But we ended up getting married. She was strongly encouraged to have an abortion. And we can talk some more about that. But we decided not to. We got married, and I became a father. So at 20, I became a father. I had this father absence issue, and then I became a father fairly early in life and was kind of struggling through that. As a 20-year-old, didn't really have a sustained model in my life. And after graduating, I went on to work for IBM. I worked for Pepsi. I worked for Princeton University for about 3 or 4 years, and then I went to work for Goldman Sachs, got an MBA, all that kind of stuff, and was there doing my thing. And I was on the board. I joined the board of an organization called National Fatherhood Initiative when I was at Goldman, and I thought, well, this is great. I'm involved in this issue, but it was the first time when I met the guy who started National Fatherhood Initiative, a guy named Don Eberly. He and I met kind of serendipitously, and when I learned about what was happening there with that organization, that was really focused on this issue of father absence, and the number of kids at the time was like 4 out of 10, if my memory serves me correct, were growing up in homes absent their biological fathers. And this was a social phenomenon that no one was talking about. It was just under the radar. And there's a guy named David Blankenhorn that wrote this book called Fatherless America. It's sort of like what Rachel Carson's like Silent Spring, I think it is. It was that kind of book that really started to raise awareness that we had this issue that was going on in the culture that no one was talking about, but they were talking about the consequences of it. Low academic performance, teen pregnancy, criminal activity, all these consequences of father absence, but no one was going to the core issue. So I met Don, and we just became fast friends. And I hadn't thought about the issue like societally. I just had thought about it personally and seeing it in my own family, the impact of my own father's absence. And the impact it had on me as a young man being a father. And it was just he and I connected at the hip, so to speak. And then I joined the board, and I'm with Goldman. And I'm thinking, this is what God has for me. I'm going to work for Goldman Sachs. And this is God's plan for my life. I mean,
right.
Goldman Sachs was started by Jewish folks, and Jesus was a Jew, so I'm thinking this is ministry,
yeah,
right? And they have gold, and they carried it in sacks. I'm thinking, okay, this is clearly God's plan. I'm like, all the theologies coming together, right? And I'd been with Goldman for about 3 years, and Don calls me up one day and says, "Listen, what do you think about leaving Goldman Sachs to come to National Fatherhood Initiative?" Mm-hmm. And I said, "Don, Jesus was a Jew. Goldman Sachs is a Jewish, the whole thing. And, they have gold and they carry it in sacks." Anyway, God kept on me, and I kind of wrestled a little bit like Jacob. But eventually I said, you know what? This is what God has called me to do. Yeah. And I quit my job in 9 days at Goldman, and that's how I became president of the National Fatherhood Initiative.
Wow.
And it really was, I mean, the cliche aside, it really was a godsend. Sure. Because God really almost had me on a couch for about 12 years working through my own fatherhood issues, the absence that I had related to my dad. Much of it I'd stuffed away, and I could see how it was affecting so many areas of my life that I hadn't really connected it back to. And it just gave me a passion around the issue and a voice around the issue that really kind of motivated me as I did that work. So I was there doing that, and I was there for about 12 years, and I thought, well, this is my thing. That's how you and I met, and I was and still am very passionate about the fatherhood issue. But during my 12th year, someone reached out to me from CareNet, which is the largest evangelical network of pregnancy centers in the country, and said, would I consider coming, put my name in the ring for that? And initially I was resistant to do that, but God made it clear, so I did, and some by hook or by crook they selected me, and it was really interesting because it kind of brought together these two, I call them like my two great objects. William Wilberforce had these two great objects: the reformation of manners and abolishing slavery, which kind of motivated him. And I thought, wow, these are these two great objects I have, which is protecting the little ones in the womb from abortion and building strong families, and then also making sure that men can be the best dads they can be. And this issue intersects. The fatherhood issue and the life issue intersect. So it's just kind of amazing to me when I look at the fact that unplanned pregnancy that I faced when I was 20 years old is very much connected to the fatherhood issue. And by the way, my dad was a teen dad as well. My father. My mother was, I think, 17 when she got pregnant. My dad was 19, so she had me, my older brother, when she was 17, and then had me when she was 19. And by the time she was 23, she had 4 kids, under the age of 8, and my dad wasn't in the picture. So this legacy of, father absence and things of that nature, and the life issue back when she had us, abortion wasn't available then. So hopefully she wouldn't have made that choice anyway, but the temptation was always there. Although back then it was obviously much more difficult to do it than it was after Roe was decided. So anyway, so that's the story of how I got here.
Yeah. Well, and it's fascinating that God takes us through things that seem like horrible situations, and that, what could God do with this to make something good out of it? But we can't see what he's doing in the moment at times, and we just have to trust. What is that? Another cliche: when you can't see his hand, trust his heart, I guess. Yes. And just recognize that God is at work. There's nothing that escapes him in all of this, and so. I am just thankful for the fact that God has brought you on this journey, and you've been obedient so that you have a voice that can speak to folks in ways that are unique because of your personal experiences. So, folks, Roland mentioned a book that just came out. Literally, we're recording this on a Tuesday. The book was released, I think, on Saturday or Sunday. I got a copy delivered on Sunday, and I've read about half of it so far. It's called The Alternative to Abortion: Why We Must Be Pro-Abundant Life. Yes. And I got to tell you, I've read a little bit about this beforehand, and we talk about being pro-life, but you really put a spin on this with this whole idea of being pro-abundant life. And you throw out this shocker in the book that Jesus wasn't pro-life. And wait a second, hear me out. You say and you ultimately come to he was pro-abundant life. So unpack that, the difference between just being pro-life and being pro-abundant life.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it comes from John 10:10, right? Which is Jesus' wise statement. Jesus said, I came that you might have life and have that life abundantly, right?
Yeah.
That's Jesus' wise statement, why he came. And when I first came to CareNet, I mean, God really downloaded that verse into my mind, because obviously we're working on life here, that life issue. And when I started to look at that verse and I looked at it in the Greek and try to really unpack what Jesus was saying there's a number of different things he's saying. I'll just go through a couple of them. But really, when you focus on the life part of what he's talking about, there's two types of life. There's this physical life that we have, which we use the Greek word bios, B-I-O-S, where we get the word biology, physical life. Right. And we talk about that in terms of a heartbeat, right? So if you have a heartbeat, you're alive, you have physical life, that kind of thing. But he's also talking about Zoe, which is a unique type of spiritual life that only comes from a relationship with God. And so essentially what he's saying in John 10:10 is I came to link your bios to my Zoe. In other words, that you might be heartbeats that are heaven bound. Heartbeats that are heaven bound. And so when I started to process that through the lens of looking at the kind of pro-life movement, if you will, that's where I came to the conclusion, wait, Jesus is not saying he's just pro-life. In other words, he's just solving for bios. Jesus is solving for bios and Zoe. So you can be an atheist and be pro-life because you're solving to save an unborn life. And that's a good thing. It's a godly thing, that, if you will, in a lot of ways in terms of that, even though you're an atheist. But it's not Christianity. Right? Christianity solves for bios and Zoe, and that's why when we think about sometimes with charities, I mean, there's lots of charities that you could give to, but people might give to World Vision or Compassion or groups like that. Why? Because they're solving for bios and Zoe, whereas maybe CARE or UNICEF, great organizations, if you will, but they're only solving for bios, but they're not solving for Zoe. So there's a unique Christian response to needs and to vulnerability that links those things, heartbeats and heaven bound. And when you walk through scripture, that's what you see Jesus doing. He's walking along and he's meeting people at their bios and calling them into Zoe. He's always meeting them at their bios and calling them into their Zoe. So as I started to process that, I said, well, gosh, then we need to be thinking about this issue differently. Because if you're just pro-life, then that means, well, she has a baby and she delivers the baby and then she goes on to be a single mother. You're going like, well, actually, really? Is that really the abundant life? I mean, is that really what God wants for mothers and for children? Having grown up in a single mother home, I know how difficult that is for mothers and for children. And when you start processing through that, you say, well, from a pro-abundant life, what does that look like? And so after that, God led me to the first chapter, the first book of the New Testament. And this is what I talk about in the book quite a bit, kind of understanding that. And God's design for family. So if you will, I have a graphic in the book where I have this roof in a house that has like a pro-abundant life roof, and then I've got two pillars that hold it up. One of them is God's design for family, and then God's call to discipleship, those two pillars that God designed so that we would have abundant life. It comes through connection in God's design for family, which is giving you the bios, right? But then also the connection that comes from God's call to discipleship, which is the family of God, which is where you get the Zoe. And so the pro-abundant life perspective links those two things together.
100%. And folks, I love books. As a matter of fact, there have been 2 books delivered by Amazon here this morning in addition to this one. So I have a disease that is an addiction to books. But I would encourage you to get this because the diagram that Roland is talking about, I read that. And before I got to the next paragraph where you were talking about Joseph, I wrote Joseph in the side margin here. So I knew where you were headed with this idea that Joseph played a special role in the life of Jesus and of Mary. And so I love the way you unpack that and how you talk about the angel that came. Joseph, as a matter of fact, I also just read this. I'm reading in the book of Matthew right now. So yesterday I read that and I could pull my Bible up and I underlined the part where it says Joseph was a good man. And so Joseph was not, he was not a hoodlum. He was not a renegade. He was a good man and sought to, even in his poor decision at first to put Mary away, he was trying to do so with an honorable spirit, I think. And so, but he needed some help to make an even better decision. And so that's part of what you set up in all of this. So talk a little bit about the model that Joseph becomes for the church as we help men make good decisions in this in pregnancy decisions. How about that?
Absolutely. And that's part, from my standpoint, when I stepped into this, that I saw was missing in the pro-life movement. There was no focus on the guy.
Right.
At all. And again, my personal story had an enormous impact because I said,
sure.
we faced a pregnancy, and I talk about that in the book. We faced a pregnancy decision, right? And the nurse that did the pregnancy test for my wife, who was a sophomore at Princeton at the time, she's like, well, how are you going to graduate from Princeton with a baby? And my wife wanted to be a doctor. How are you going to become a doctor with a baby? So she's sitting there with this, her hopes and dreams for her future. And the nurse is saying, you're not going to accomplish any of those things, and that nothing good can come from this pregnancy. Right. And by God's grace, I said, no, we're going to get married and we're going to move forward the plan. I'll be a husband to you and a father to the child growing inside of you.
Praise the Lord. That's a tremendous courage there from somewhere.
Well, I tell you that, and it's by the grace of God, because I know other guys make different decisions, but I look back on that and then I saw the parallel between the dilemma that I faced and the parallel between the dilemma my wife faced and between what's happened with Joseph and what happened with Mary. Right. Because Mary had hopes and dreams for her life that did not include a child at this time and in this way. Yep. And she gets this news. And although the way she got pregnant was different from the way that my wife Yvette got pregnant, the circumstances and the consequences of it going forward were the same. How am I going to tell my father? Right. All of this? Just all this uncertainty swirling around in her head. And what does Mary do? She says, what? No, I'm not going to focus on the uncertainty of what I don't know. I'm going to focus on the certainty of what I do know. There's a life growing inside of me, and it's not a life worth sacrificing, but a life worth sacrificing for. Let it be unto me, as you have said, and she chooses life. And what I found was, in the pro-life movement, we love to tell the story of Mary. And essentially the work is trying to encourage women to ascribe to themselves the virtue and the character of Mary, that despite all the uncertainty of what you don't know, focus on the certainty of what you do. There's a life growing inside of you, and it's not a life worth sacrificing, but a life worth sacrificing for. Now, for a lot of folks, they go like, got it, Roland, close their Bibles. We're supposed to be helping the proverbial Marys and saving the proverbial Jesuses. But you got to keep reading. Yeah. What did God do to make sure that Mary's unplanned pregnancy wasn't a crisis pregnancy? He sent an angel to Joseph. And Joseph faced the same dilemma that I did, right? Hopes and dreams for Mary, and her life with Mary that did not include a child at this time and in this way. Lots of uncertainty, right? And there's a temptation for the guy. So Joseph faced a similar dilemma as any guy in that situation. And back then, since you couldn't put the baby away, you put the woman and the baby away. It was a cultural version of an abortion, basically. Right. Because honestly, if he had exposed her that way, she probably would have been stoned because they were in a covenant relationship, a marriage that had not been consummated. This was adultery. That's why he was going to divorce her quietly. Right. And so Mary would have been stoned, which means Jesus would have been stoned. Right. Right? So Joseph steps into that moment and says, no. Despite the uncertainty of what I don't know, I'm focusing on the certainty of what I do, the word that I got from God, right? The word that I got from God. And he said, let it be unto me, as you said, essentially. And he said, I'll be a husband to you and a father to the child growing inside of you. So that's that first pillar of God's design for family, which we see modeled in the birth of Christ. An unplanned pregnancy from a human perspective. How did God respond? He created a family. And he can't create a family in God's design without who? The guy. And what I saw in this movement was there wasn't a focus on the guy. There wasn't a focus on bringing the guy in. And then the data shows 87% of the women who have abortions are unmarried. So what you see in the story of Mary and Joseph is two sanctities. The sanctity of marriage and family and the sanctity of life. Because the first thing the angel told Joseph to do was what? Do not be afraid to take her as your what? Baby mama? No, not even in the Message version of the Bible. It's like, do not be afraid to take her as your wife. So what you see is the sanctity of marriage and family consistent with God's design and the sanctity of life. And he tells him to affirm the sanctity of marriage and family even before he tells him who Jesus is.
Yeah.
And so my observation was that we kind of pivoted to focusing on the sanctity of life, but we abandoned the sanctity of marriage and family. And then that means that we create a community of single mothers who then are more at risk for more abortions, and then their kids are more at risk for more abortions. And it's not God's design. So in the first chapter, the first book of the New Testament, what you see is God's design for family. And that inspired me and said, my gosh, this is what we need to be doing in this movement. And that's the difference between being pro-life and being pro-abundant life. Because being pro-abundant life means you're trying to build a family, not just save a baby. And oh, by the way, when you build a family, you save the baby, because a woman who has that guy saying, I'll be a husband to you, a father to the child growing inside of you, guess what she's less likely to do? Abort the child, which means she's more likely to do what? Give the child bios, physical life.
Well, when you say, when you create the family, or when you add emphasis to creating the family, so we get this that creates the environment where the child can grow up and have a healthy child life and a healthy opportunity to miss poverty and drug abuse and all of these things that happen because a child grows up in a biological family. The statistics go way up for success, and statistics for poverty and all of the other things go way down when we can see a family formed, not just a baby born. And so we got to work on the bigger picture of this. And I appreciate so much the fact that I'm going to throw out some other things here. You mentioned in another interview that I listened to that this is not just a political issue. Sometimes we make it so much a political issue. It's not just a sociological issue. I mean, I love the fact that secular research affirms everything that you just said. But for us as followers of Jesus, this is a theological issue, and we are talking about people who are being formed in the image of God and God's plan, God's design from Genesis 1 for what a family should look like. And so this is truly much bigger than politics or sociology. It is theology that honors the Lord. So, I know you agree with that. I'm going to give you one more softball, and then you can hit them both at the same time. But you also you breezed by a couple of phrases that I think are so important that I grabbed a highlighter. I don't normally highlight; I normally underline. But you talked about that we often see the child as a life worth sacrificing, rather than a life worth sacrificing for.
Yeah.
And man, when we can see that this is not, we're not sacrificing this life, but we're sacrificing for this life. We're stepping into the gap so that this child, this family can not only be saved, but can flourish.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden it's more than just getting the baby to term. It's seeing the potential of a full life and making sure that all the pieces are in place to provide that opportunity, not just for a child to be born, but for an adult to someday flourish.
Absolutely. And that really is what you see, right? Because that's the role of the family, right? Yeah. The role of the family is to create that human flourishing. I mean, God started in the garden with a family. Yeah. Yeah. Right? Didn't have to, right? Didn't have to. And what you see in the birth of Christ is a family being formed. Look, the scripture could have been written in such a way that Jesus came into the world via a single mother. I mean, it could have been written that way. Sure. I mean, you think that God really needed Joseph to protect? I mean, like, wait a minute. I can do immaculate conception, but protecting Mary from a bunch of guys with stones, that's beyond my power. I mean, come on. No. There was a message here, right? There was a reason here. And here's the thing. You know, John 1:1 says, what? In the beginning there was the word, right? Logos. And if you look up the word logos in the Greek, it has three aspects to it, which are very relevant here. In the beginning was the word, right? In the beginning was the word. The first aspect is message, right? Yeah. The second aspect is reason. And the third aspect is plan. So in other words, in the beginning there was a message. In the beginning there was a reason. And in the beginning there was a plan. Mm-hmm. So Jesus is the word. right?
Yeah.
Jesus is the Word. So what does that mean? When he came into the world, there was a message, there was a reason, and there was also a plan. So with the birth of Christ, there is a message, there is a reason, and there is a plan as it pertains to God's design for family.
Right.
So Jesus came into the world in a way that accomplished God's purpose to bring the Savior into the world with the message, the reason, and the plan, but not violating his principle, which is his design for family, which has a message, a reason, and a plan. Do you see? So,
absolutely.
So that's the part, in my view, as I started to think about the life issue, that we lost in part of the narrative. We lost it as Christians, and we started having basically trying to solve this issue with the tools. I always say trying to solve the issue with the tools of Caesar. And what I mean by that is,
there you go. Yep.
When Jesus was given the coin, right? He was asked, render to Caesar what is Caesar. He said, render to Caesar what is Caesar, and unto God what is God. What did Caesar care about, right? Political power and material wealth. Those were his tools, right? So I always tell people I use my hands as a triangle. At the top, you've got political power. In this corner, you've got material wealth. And Jesus is saying there's a higher thing. Things of God. Well, what are those things of God? Well, it's the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. Those are the higher things. Jesus walked around living out the Great Commandment to fulfill the Great Commission. That's what he did all day long. And what happened is that we said, okay, wait a minute. You can't live out the Great Commandment to fulfill the Great Commission without caring for human needs. Mm-hmm. And you can't live out the Great Commandment to fulfill the Great Commission without being engaged politically, because we're supposed to care for the vulnerable. And we know that the government is harsh and unmerciful and unjust to who? Typically the vulnerable, right? So as Christians, we're called to do those things, but there's a higher thing. What I saw happen in the pro-life movement, in my view, is that this triangle got inverted. Yeah. So that the higher thing became the lower thing. So we're going to try to solve the life issue solely with material support or solely with political engagement. And you see that can't. No. Right. And then we wonder why the church isn't engaged and pastors aren't leading. Well, we've told them that you're the lower thing. Right. Christ says, no. He's the higher thing. So when you have a pro-abundant life perspective, right, what you're really doing is living out the Great Commandment to fulfill the Great Commission. Because the Great Commandment is the call of the family. Right. To love God, to love neighbor, love self. Every conflict in families and communities is because of an issue with the Great Commandment, including abortion. Mm-hmm. That's why Christians can't support abortion, because abortion is a violation of the Great Commandment. Why? Mm-hmm. The child in the womb is her neighbor. The Greek word for neighbor means near one. And we talk about nearness in two ways. Proximity, I'm next to you, or relationship, I'm your next of kin. The child in the womb is her next of kin, next to her. Boxes. Yes, in the most intimate way. And the word for love used in the Great Commandment is agapeo, which is sacrificial. So you're supposed to sacrificially love your near one. How do you reconcile that with abortion? And for the guy, it's his nearest near one too. Why? Because it's bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. It's his neighbor, right? So the role of the family is to live out the Great Commandment, right? And but also to fulfill the Great Commission, which is to make disciples. When you kill one of your children, that's not an act of discipleship. Right. And every parent's first discipleship community is the children God gives you. So that's why you cannot be a Christian. Be a Christian and be pro-choice, because being pro-choice is a violation of both the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. You see? So when Joseph stepped into that role, what was he doing? He was living out the Great Commandment to fulfill the Great Commission he didn't even know about yet. But God created a construct to do that, and that's all Jesus did. He walked around living out the Great Commandment, loving neighbor, like the whole thing, all of his acts, to do what? To fulfill the Great Commission, finalized on the cross, living out the Great Commandment to what end? To fulfill the Great Commission. The life issue has to be viewed through exactly that same lens. And what's happened because of this triangle, people say, well, this is a material support issue. We're just trying to give her material support, or political issue. We just try to make sure she can have an abortion. No. This is about her becoming a disciple of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. And the guy who got her pregnant becoming a disciple of Jesus Christ, which, by the way, is what happened with Mary and Joseph. Right.
Well, and it's what happened with Roland and Yvette to some extent. I mean,
Yes.
again, folks, you read the introduction to the book, Roland tells his story, and you said that you were both believers,
Yes.
but obviously, and you knew that what you were involved in was not in keeping with orthodoxy. I won't go any further than that. But I want to say this. In your chapter, when you talked about men, you said, now Joseph was a man and Joseph had a plan. He did. And he was a good man with a plan. And this ties into the noble warrior's name. Isaiah 32:8 is where I got the word noble to use in noble warriors. And in the NIV, it says, but the noble man makes noble plans, and by noble deeds he stands.
Amen.
And so Joseph, he tells us, was a noble man, and he had a plan, but his plan was not noble. And in comes Gabriel, the angel, to give him some wisdom and some advice. So next thing to set up for you, Roland, is, was there a Gabriel-like intercession? Not an angel, I get that, but did someone come beside you and help you make a good decision when you were 20 years old? And then just jump right from that into the vision that you see for how churches can commission Gabriels to come alongside young men who are facing pregnancy decisions with their wives or their girlfriends, or quite honestly, sometimes it's a dad who has to help with this decision, or a caring uncle. And you can get into the research about how important it is for a girl with a pregnancy decision to have someone who is willing to walk with her, a guy, and help her with those decisions. So I've teed up another one. Go.
Yeah, well, I love what you said about Joseph being a man with a plan, right? Because that's what I wrote. But here's the thing. Joseph didn't have the message, and he didn't have the reason.
Right.
So if you don't have the message of God and the reason of God, then the plan is not of God.
Right.
So when the angel came in and said, I know you got a plan, but let me give you a message and a reason. So when you get a message and a reason, it should change your plan, which of course it did.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
And I think in my own life, I can't think of a specific person that actually kind of did that. I just think that in a lot of ways, in God's grace, that we just knew that this was a life. And despite of the uncertainty, I always tell people, the pregnancy test is a message.
Yeah.
And when it's a message, you're carrying a human life. And if this is a human life. Okay, then we didn't understand the reason, and we didn't understand God's plan, but we understood the message.
Yeah.
We understood the message. And from that, because we understood the message and we believed the message, then we trusted God for the reason and we trusted God for the plan. Now I can see the reason in the plan now. This conversation you and I are having, the people have been impacted by Yvette and my story. People coming up to me saying, gosh, I heard your story and I was going to abort my baby and now I'm not. I mean, I didn't know that as a 20-year-old.
Right.
I just knew the message. Right. And God doesn't always give us the reason and the plan, but you got to trust the message. That's why in the beginning of the word is so critically important. Well, in terms of transition to what the church can do, I've kind of talked about it a little bit. The church has to lead on this issue.
Right.
This isn't and the politics have been leading on this issue for the most part, right? But the church has to lead on this issue, which means pastors have to lead. And that's only going to happen if the issue is viewed through the primary call of the church. And the primary call of the church is to live out the Great Commandment, to fulfill the Great Commission.
Right.
So I talk to pastors often. I'll say, how many became pastors because you wanted to overturn Roe v. Wade when that was a thing? Nobody raises their hand. I say, well, how many became pastors because you wanted to end abortion in your lifetime? No one ever raises their hand. Then I say, how many became pastors because you felt called to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, to make disciples for Jesus Christ, to live out the Great Commandment, to fulfill the Great Commission? Every hand goes up. What does that tell you? If pastors don't see the life issue as a discipleship, a Great Commandment, Great Commission issue, and don't see the woman facing an unplanned pregnancy as someone who needs to become a disciple of Jesus Christ, or in the case of Yvette and I, walk in the fullness of the discipleship that we're called to, then this is an issue that's outside the church that the church cares about, but it's not inside the church as the core mission of the church. Our entire faith is built on an unplanned pregnancy from a human perspective and how God responded to it. To what end? That we might become disciples of Jesus Christ. So when you see that woman facing an unplanned pregnancy, that should be your first thought. Is she a disciple of Jesus Christ? Well, let me help her walk in the fullness of that to bring her child into the world, to live out the great commandment, to fulfill the great commission. If she's not a disciple of Jesus Christ, then I need to help her become a disciple of Jesus Christ. In other words, God is using this unplanned pregnancy in her life, right? To what end? That she might become a disciple of Jesus Christ in the same way that Mary became a disciple of Jesus Christ, facing an unplanned pregnancy. So from a ministry component, the church has to lead, but the why always drives the what. So if your church does not see this issue as a great commandment, great commission issue, but sees it as a material support and political issue, then you're not going to have engagement around this, right? You're not going to have the plan, the reason and the plan laid out the right way, because the message of why you're doing what you're doing is not fully there. In other words, so you're going to let the politics drive it or the material support drive it instead of letting the gospel of Jesus Christ drive our response to this issue and take this issue back from the political square. There's a role for that, but the church should lead. And you hear people say that all the time, even on the advocacy side of the work. This is a moral issue. Well, if it's a moral issue, then who should be leading? Right. But we, again, as I said, with this triangle. So we have a ministry component, and one of the things that's in the book, there's call to actions all through the book at the end. That last chapter is all about that. But I'll just get to one really quickly as we kind of close up here. We have a resource called Making Life Disciples, which we designed specifically to help churches put ministries in the church so that small groups in the church can come alongside folks who are facing pregnancy decisions inside and outside the church to help them, right? And there's a chart in there I have about the missing support. This really is about this woman from conception to birth. She has missing support that drives this decision: physical, emotional, spiritual, and social mission support. A key mechanism to get her that support is the husband and father, the guy to step into that role. But when that's not possible, right? That's the role of the church, to care for that cultural orphan and widow, if you will, right? James 1:27, and to come alongside them. We have so many churches that have small groups, and so many of our small groups are about us loving us. What if your small group became about us loving them? What if you said, you know what, I'm going to contact my local pregnancy center. I'm going to have a ministry in my church so that if anyone in church is facing a pregnancy decision, they know that there is a ministry here that is going to walk alongside them to help them with their physical, emotional, spiritual, and social support that they need. When you start stringing that together, it's amazing. There are only about 3,500 pregnancy centers in the entire nation. There's over 300,000 churches. I mean, at least half of them are life affirming, but because we've allowed the politics to drive this issue, the church can be engaged in, filling out baby bottles and various other things, all important things that need to happen. But you got to be saying, no, we need to help these people become disciples of Jesus Christ so that they never face an unplanned pregnancy again. And I can say in my own life, my wife and I, we had one unplanned pregnancy. Right? I always tease and say the second one, she tricked me, but I have two sons, both of which we had at Princeton, by the way. Our story's also in there too. But we had one unplanned pregnancy. And why? We created a family. So we didn't actually have a crisis. We had an unplanned pregnancy, but we didn't have a crisis pregnancy because we created a family, right? And that's really the call of the church. The church is the keeper of God's design for family. And the church is the keeper of God's call to discipleship. That's distinctly initiative of the church.
Absolutely. All right. So let me get to this final thing. And that is, I'm a men's ministry guy. So I'm pressing on the church all the time to see men discipled well. And so often the men of the church look at this fight for life and leave this in the hands of the women because, and you talk about this in the book, that it's always been framed as a women's issue. But when you see the research and you understand how influential men are, and man, there's some great case studies of what's going on in communities where churches are coming together to minister to the fathers who are facing a pregnancy decision with their partner, wife, girlfriend, whatever it is. But we need to cast vision for more men to be involved in this, even just at a level of awareness. And I'll add to that, I just had a conversation with a personal friend who 40 some years ago got his girlfriend pregnant and took her for an abortion, and he is still dealing. He's in ministry now, but he's still dealing with the post-abortive pain, strain, the shame of that. And so I got to believe there are men sitting in the pews that need to be ministered to, and then their story be unleashed to become ministry valuable. And so we see beauty from ashes. So speak to that and how churches can really engage men, and we see that aspect of the ministry step up.
Oh, absolutely. That's the missing piece. And frankly, that's what the other side wants men to do. They want them to make like Adam and just shut up.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because the first abortion, I always tell you, the first abortion actually happened in the garden. My fruit, my choice. Because abortion is about saying, I know what's better for my life than God does. Right?
Yeah.
And Adam's just supposed to sit there and keep quiet. That's what the evil one always wants Adam to do, men to do, to be sit there and be quiet and thinking that we have no responsibility in this, which God kind of pointed that out when he was looking for who?
Yeah.
Adam. Right? Anyway, so I think that is such an important issue. And are so many men who are post-abortive. And that's one of the key ministry platforms that we have at CareNet. It's called ARC, Abortion Recovery and Care. We have a ministry kit for women called Forgiven and Set Free. And then we have a ministry kit for men called Reclaiming Fatherhood. And one of the stories I use often when talking about men and the abortion issue is Peter. Because Peter aborted Jesus. Yep. Because abortion is a rejection of vulnerable life. And typically it's because you're isolated, you're fearful, just like Peter was, right? And Peter does it. He rejects Jesus, not just the life, but the way, the truth, and the life. He knows that. And it's such a beautiful story that when Jesus is resurrected, right? And he's calling the disciples, and the scripture says, call my disciples and Peter too. And why is that? Because Peter said, I'm not worthy to be in. I can't step into this because look what how could, even if he's putting the band back together, I can't be a part of it, right? Yeah. Because I want, and he's like, no. And then you see that wonderful scene where he calls Peter and he says, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And what does he do? Peter is restored. Right? He's restored. Right. Jesus reestablishes that covenant relationship. But then what does he do? He doesn't say, well, great, now have some fish and some bread. No. He tells him to what? Feed my sheep. In other words, he's called and then he's missioned. Right. I think just an army, and there's an army of men out there who are post-abortive men. Yeah. Who, yes, you aborted, if you will, the life. But Jesus says, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And if you say yes, then there's a mission for you.
There's work for you to do.
There's work for you to do. And as you know, Peter never aborted Jesus ever again, became this amazing disciple. So out of all of that, so from my standpoint, I really want to encourage men, if you're post-abortive, if your wife is post-abortive, there are women sitting in the pews with the same Peter thing. I can't get involved in this issue. Yeah. And some of them, frankly, become pro-choice because I gotta be, because I'm a hypocrite. If I would tell someone not to bring their child, not to have an abortion, how could I do that when I did it? Like, no, that's what Satan uses to paralyze you and to keep you off of the work, away from the work that he's called you to do. So absolutely. So in the book, we have a way that you can get to the post-abortive abortion ministry at CareNet, Forgiven and Set Free for Women, Reclaiming Fatherhood for Men. And it really just walks through. There's a call to action at the end of the book, but it's a very practical book that gives you step-by-step ways of looking at this issue. And my call at the end of the book is, are you pro-abundant life? Do you see the difference between being pro-life and being pro-abundant life, and how that's distinctly connected to the call that Christ has for each and every one of us?
Yeah. Well, listen, I know I've got to let you go, but this has been a blessed time. Thank you so much, brother, for taking time. This has been fun. I may call you again and we do this because I feel like there's more to unpack here. Yeah. And there's more for us to say, especially to men about this. I tell folks that wounded men are dangerous men, but men who've brought their wounds to the cross and they've seen Christ redeem the mistakes or the decisions that they've made, those scars are beautiful, and God uses those men. So, Roland, thank you for your transparency. Thank you for your leadership at CareNet and for the National Fatherhood Initiative. And thank you for your friendship, brother.
All right, likewise. Thanks a lot, sir. Blessings to you.
All right, God bless you, friend. Thanks so much. Bye-bye. Take care. Well, folks, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Noble Man Podcast. Listen, order, pick up, buy a copy of Roland's book, The Alternative to Abortion, Why We Must Have Pro-Abundant Life. It's available everywhere, and I hope you will pay attention to what CareNet pregnancy centers are doing and get involved in your local center near you. God bless you, folks, and we'll look forward to getting with you next week again. Take care.